My name's Guy, you're watching Midwinter Minis. This video has been sponsored by Audible. We just hit 300,000 subscribers, and Chaos Space Marine vehicles kinda suck. Well, at least the ones that share a kit with their loyalist counterparts. I've had this Land Raider kit for years. It's probably the model I've owned the longest that still hasn't been built or painted. I knew I wanted to do something fun with it, I just didn't know what. The problem was I have a Nurgle themed Chaos Space Marine army, and even this was the Chaos Space Marine version with the extra bad guy sprue. It's still just an Imperial tank with spikes, hardly befitting a force dedicated to rot, decay, disease, despair, and destruction. So let's have some fun with it, and make a true demon engine that can be a linking centerpiece of my Nurgle Demon and Chaos Space Marine armies. Another reason I've been putting off building this kit is that I got it second hand, and I know it's missing a couple of parts. Annoying if you're a perfectionist, but as I'll be so heavily customizing it, it shouldn't really matter at all. Now, as you'll see, I'll be doing some pretty crazy stuff with this tank, and you're obviously totally welcome to follow along if you want, but the aim of this project is to really force myself into throwing caution to the wind, stop overthinking every step, and just have fun, and make something unique. And hopefully that might inspire you to do the same, no matter what project it is or army it's for. As far as the build goes, this is probably where I start deviating from the official instructions. The chassis is built, the tracks are attached, but none of the fittings or weapons are added yet. As you can see, I'm missing a couple of track sections, but no problem, we can mask those later. I know for a fact that I'm going to have to give it 4 las cannons and 2 heavy bolters, the standard Land Raider armament, but that's the only requirement for it to make sense on the tabletop. And that means I'm going to be left with loads of very cool, very useful bits for my bits box, future kit bashes, terrain projects, all sorts. Speaking of kit bashes, who says you just have to use model kits? I found this cheeky Hulk toy for a bargain price in a charity shop, and check out all those rippling muscles. Why bother sculpting something out of milliput if you can just rip the arms off a kid's toy and stick them on your grown-up toy? Ha! Not so tough now, are you, mate? Yeah, thought so. Right then, next one. Well, come on. Actually, you are still quite tough, I'll give you that. Hey, there we go. I don't want to break the forearms, so I'll use a razor saw to cut the hands off. I may as well keep these, huh? I could make some cool terrain bits or objective markers, who knows. I don't want these arms to sit too low on the Land Raider's hull, so I'll use my rotary tool to grind away some of the plastic on the upper edge of the front doorway. And while I had that out, I used it to buff down some of the huge mould lines and seams on the arms too. I swapped out the tool head to a cutting disc and started opening up the forearms, trying to leave a gap at the centre that I could maybe fit some combination of weapons into. And while you watch me do some incredibly safe, very responsible freehand cutting with power tools, let me tell you about what I was listening to for most of this project. As I said, this video has been kindly sponsored by Audible, and I've decided to revisit a classic that I'd actually studied way back in my GCSEs, William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Now, I know it's been out for 70 years and is in literally every list of essential novels ever made. I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't read it yet. It's basically about schoolboys stranded on a paradise island after an air crash, and their descent from well-educated, well-mannered civility into primal savagery. And as fun as it was to do class reading back in the day, it's actually very nice to have this story narrated so well by Martin Jarvis, with his prim and proper delivery subtly accentuating the narrative. It's not a heavy slog either, just a 7-hour listen and well worth the time. If you want to try Audible out for yourself, you can get a 1-month free trial on me by visiting audible.com/midwinterminis or texting midwinterminis to 500500. There's loads of great free audiobooks, podcasts, serialized shows, and Audible exclusives for you to enjoy, on top of monthly credits to spend on whatever audiobook takes your fancy. I love hobbying while listening to audiobooks, and I think it feels like a really productive use of my time, and maybe you'd like to give it a try too. Anyway, doing this kind of custom cutting work makes loads and loads of mess, but all of these interestingly shaped fragments and offcuts can be kept for creating realistic debris in Warzone rubble, which is a quick tutorial I'll be making in the near future, so keep an eye out for that one, but save your mess in the meantime. I glued both the left and right sections from both las cannon assemblies together and prepped the heavy bolters ready to be added to the model. And while I'm at it, let's crack out the milliput and start mixing it. It has hours of working time, so the sooner we can get the two parts smushed together, the sooner we can have some fun. As I said, this is going to be rough and ready, so let's just jam some mixed milliput into the new wrist holes, stick those las cannon arrays in, and then do a quick and nasty smoothing job with a moist finger. Land Raiders not only have an armoured door on each side, but they also have an assault ramp right at the front. Given the theme of transmogrification, body horror, and just gross nastiness that Nurgle models typify, I'll be replacing the side doors with sphincters and the assault ramp with the nastiest mouth you've ever seen. To give the milliput something solid to build up a structure on, I cut out some shapes from chipboard and superglued them in place. Alright, sculpting time. On the recommendation of literally everyone in the last video where I sculpted milliput, this time I rolled it all out into little snakes for easy forming. Also, loads of the stuff I'm going to be sculpting is going to be gross, fibrous, or wormy, so it's a win-win however you look at it. For the sphincter side doors, I started laying down some milliput worms, poking them around the corner of the opening so it'll keep the edge looking more natural and less sharp. Once all the chipboard was hidden, I wet my finger and smoothed out the milliput snakes, pressing them into the surrounding armour panels, hopefully to make it a bit more of a mystery where the demon ends and the engine begins. And yes, I'm fully aware of how dodgy this looks. I accidentally covered the tiny hole on the closed side, but no worries, I just used a pencil to poke it open again. Pencils are actually pretty good tools for milliput sculpting, because you can sharpen them or blunt them as you need to, but when you're done you can always just sharpen them and use them as pencils again. I then used a wet cocktail stick to sculpt in some crude details. I'm not overly worried about making this look perfect because I'll be using lots of cheaty effects to hide my amateur sculpting later. For the mouth, I laid down some fat snakes around the chipboard lid, forming the rough shape of gums and lips, and adding more and more layers to make a bed of milliput nice and thick for the teeth. Teeth? Teeth. These are cheap emergency denture replacements. Not too expensive, these boxes cost me £4 each. One is full of incisors and canines, and the other has molars and premolars. Obviously these are regular human-sized teeth, not scale models, but on a model this large, I think they might work quite nicely. I placed them haphazardly, jamming them into the milliput. Fantastic. I'll add more sculpting detail to the mouth in a minute, but first let's give this demon engine some eyes. As you may remember, my Nurgle demon army features some nasty eyes made from cabochons, an idea I got after watching a video by the Craftsman. And I thought it would be a fun way to link my Bringers of Decay with my eye bearers to have a Chaos Space Marine tank with big, nasty eyeballs. I cut the headlight hoods off the hull and glued on some 20mm eyeball cabochons, one covering one of the headlight holes and two more covering the hatch holes on top. I'm going to cut away the headlight cover on the other side too, but not attach an eye. I'd like to have it missing one eye. They are pretty big and vulnerable after all, and it'll add bonus gross points to the finished model. I added layers of fat, moist milliput snakes around the eyeballs to mask their edges, and also bulk up some rudimentary eyelid shapes, and use a mix of tools, wet fingers, silicone edges, and cocktail sticks to sculpt in some very basic skin fold details on the eyelids. Again, I'm not too fussed about making the sculpt themselves look super realistic, as hopefully I can use some painty and texture tricks later to make it look even better than it really is. In preparation for mounting the twin heavy bolter turret, I blocked off the hole with some more chipboard, tested the placement, cleaned up the bolters of mold lines and drilled out the barrels. If you use Tamiya thin cement like me, you can quickly whip around the holes of any stuff you drill to make sure the edges look a bit smoother and less raw. I wanted to add some organic, gloopy effects to the body, especially around the missing eye, covering this hole in the tracks, and maybe even seeping out of the doors. Thinking back to the time I stupidly mixed some JB Weld 2-part plastic epoxy in my cut palette and accidentally opened a portal to hell, I reckon this stuff will do a great job. It'll also make quick work of gluing the hulk arms to the hull too. I tested the fit, but this stuff won't cure in a few minutes, so let's add some nasty details elsewhere while I wait for it to be tough enough to stick the arms. Oh dear. Oh, that's nasty. I also added some trailing down over the missing tracks at the back, and I thought the areas under the arms on the hull were looking a bit plain, so I decided to revisit Hulk on the dissection table and see what else I could borrow. There's loads of great pre-sculpted musculature on the torso and back, so let's cut him open and see what we can salvage. So it turns out it has a really tough interlocked internal structure, so I'm going to have to manually cut out the bits I want and trim the plastic off the back. Annoying, but doable. With a bit of help from the razor saw to get through the last few locks inside the body, Hulk's abs are mine. I cut away the rest of the plastic behind the front plate and filed off the rough edges before scoping out where I could use them on the model. Aw man, they fit almost perfectly under the arms, covering that little hole too. I marked out the sections that I wanted on each side and cut them to fit. And totally randomly, the offcuts of abdominals fit beautifully into this little section above the mouth. Yeah, why not? I glued that in place and then set to work fleshing out, literally, the rest of the model. I bulked up the area that will support the heavy bolter with some scrunched up foil, superglued the turret in place, and squidged it roughly into the shape I wanted with the back of the brush. Time for way more milliput. I find it helps if you plop the darker part of milliput in very hot water for 20 seconds or so before working with it, as it makes it way easier to mix than if it was cold. Okay, let's make a sad eyelid for that missing eye. Nice. I built up the lips a bit more and masked areas where it transitions into the ab muscles. I added some more layers to the lips and gums, and smoothed out areas where the body erupted from the hull of the tank, and blended the areas where the arms and torso muscles border each other. I also want to mask off those missing tracks at the back in the grossest way I can think of, a big, slimy curtain of wormy tendrils. I used the last of the milliput I had to make a few little tendril cable things stretching over the hull, and let it dry. In the morning, everything was cured and ready for more abuse. I keep a little tub of old, dead cables for use in hobby projects, so this USB cable got snipped up, matched up to a drill bit the right size, and then I bored out some holes in the arms and torso to connect the cables. They're about exactly the same size as the snakes I rolled out of milliput at the end of the night too, so they should look pretty good when all painted up. To protect the eyeballs from being painted over, I masked them off with blue tack. Quick and easy, no messing around, and easy to remove later. The whole model got a light coat of black spray paint from every angle I could get it from, but before I added a second coat, I want to use the old superglue and PVA trick to add some disgusting gore effects to the model. Just add PVA with a brush, drop on some superglue and leave it for a second to start reacting. Then agitate it a little bit with the end of a cocktail stick, and boom, instant, slimy, gross, torn skin and muscle fibers, enough to make your stomach turn. I added this everywhere I thought it would make sense, or where my sculpting was particularly slapdash to mask the lazy details, and add some realistic, nasty textures. You can add layer upon layer of this effect, and it gets more and more gross and bulky each time. And if you haven't tried this before, it's very, very fun. It's very messy, but it's rewarding, and very, very, very easy. Just make sure your space is well ventilated if you're using superglue for an extended period of time. So here's all the places I added the effect. Looks like he's had an interesting time. Anyway, I gave the whole thing another coat of black spray paint, and then got to painting. The first step was to create a basic armor tone, following the recipe from the rest of my Bringers of Decay army, with a mix of Vallejo light grey-green and Citadel Balthazar gold, roughly dry brushed all over the metal parts. I then added a blend of Nuln oil and Typhus corrosion all over the metal parts, avoiding the fleshy bits. This will not only stain the armor, but I'll also add tiny, scale-appropriate texture to the model too. One downside though is that it really messes up any brush you use to apply it, as the microplastics or whatever they use to add texture get caught up inside the bristles and can't be easily cleaned out, making your bristles splay out like this forever. Another dry brush with that light grey green and gold mix to buff out some of the shiny colour, and we can move on to base coating the fleshy bits. I started off with a mix of Rhinox hide and corn red to create a very warm undertone that complements the hull colour, and used my airbrush to apply thin base coats. Airbrushes are really useful for things like this, because the edges of the paint are much softer and instantly create subtle colour transitions than if you were doing it with a brush. I then mixed khaki and corn red and started building up the skin tone in thin layers, focusing on the areas where the muscles bulge outwards and doing my best to avoid the recesses and the armour, obviously. A bit of overspray is inevitable when you're doing things quickly like this, and if you're not masking anything off like I was, but that's fine, nothing is finished yet and mistakes can be fixed. I added a bit more khaki, and then finally some pale sand into the airbrush cup, letting it mix with the previous colours to keep the tonal change subtle, being more and more sparing with the highlights as the colour in the cup got lighter and lighter, until it was just a few final sprays of thin pale sand. Next, I grabbed the Coat Darm super washes that I used to paint the majority of this skin on my eye bearer models, so light brown, mid brown, and dark brown, and used those to stain everything. These are kind of very heavy washes that settle into recesses really well, so hopefully they'll help complement my subpar sculpting. I didn't use them in any specific way, I just added a little here, a little there, letting the different super washes mix together in some areas, very free and easy. I then added Nuln Oil, a black wash, to all of the areas that I wanted to be a bit more silvery or gunmetal coloured, like the tracks and engine parts. Now, turns out I don't have very many fleshy pinks in my paint collection, so I mixed corn red and pale sand together to create a base coat colour for the little intestine worm cable things that cover the model. Then, once the super washes were dry, I gave all the fleshy parts a very, very gentle dry brush of pale sand using the softest brush I could find. I don't want to add any hard details here, just give the raised and pronounced areas a little bit more brightness just to bump up the contrast. I then used Gunmetal Grey from Green Stuff World to dry brush some silvery highlights onto the tracks, gun barrels, and engine vents and pipes. The teeth are going to be one of the most noticeable parts of the model, so I want to make sure they look good. I gave them a solid, careful base coat with pale sand, and once 2 coats were down, I painted the nasty lips and gums with Vallejo Squid Pink, which does look super vibrant right now, but will act as a nice base coat to mute down with washes in a minute. I mixed pale sand and squid pink together to create some nice sketchy highlights on the lips, and also used this colour to add striations to the wormy gut cables. Subtle, but gross. Perfect. I used Rhinox Hide to base coat the doorway seepage, and slapped a few streaks around the edges for good measure too. I also base coated the random bits of gore and rot around the mouth with this paint, and then I very carefully painted some cracks onto the teeth and reached into the mouth to add a few spots of decay on the molars. The guns on my Bringers of Decay Force have red weapon casings, so to keep the theme, I base coated the housing of the las cannon array and the twin bolters with Mephiston Red. I added a little bit of water to that Mephiston Red on my palette, and a few drops of black wash to create a nice gory red wash, and applied that to all the areas of PVA superglue texture that I added earlier. I also used it to stain the wormy gut bits, as well as the gums and lips. Right, I'm not doing any more spraying or dry brushing now, so time to reveal those nasty eyeballs. The plastic of the cabochons has some milliput residue clouding it up a bit, so I got some airbrush cleaner on a cotton bud and gave them a good rub clean. There we go, nice and shiny. I used that pale sand and squid pink mix again to base coat the inner edges of the eyelids to make them look nice and fresh. Once that was done, the red weapon housing was definitely dry, so I gave them a very rough edge highlight with Vallejo Scarlet Blood. I also dribbled a bit of that Mephiston Red Nuln Oil mix that was still wet on my palette into the recesses of the eyelids and swabbed away the staining on the eyeball itself. That'll make it look nice and realistic. To add some more interest to the seepage, I used thinned Vallejo Burnt Umber to add some alternative colour and shading, and the old 90s Citadel Paint Snakebite Leather to add some gross highlights. I gave the teeth and gums an all-over wash with Agrax Earthshade to add an unclean, yellowed look, and also thinned it 1-to-1 with water to add some very subtle recess shading to the muscles on the arms and torso bits. Now going back to pale sand once the mouth was dry, I added thin layers in downward strokes to the front of the teeth, creating a realistic texture, but being careful to avoid the decay and cracks I'd already painted on. And for a final highlight on the teeth, I added a tiny bit of white ink into that pale sand. To bump up the contrast on the hull and the armour panels, I mixed black wash and brown wash together and used a fine tipped brush to carefully panel line some of the details on the armour, especially where things looked a bit bland or washed out. Now let's add some cool effects. First off, one of my favourites, Blood for the Blood God. This is a blood coloured paint that dries with a very glossy, wet finish with some extra gloopy volume and translucency. Very nasty. I slapped this on all the areas I wanted to look gory, where muscles or wounds were exposed. If you want the effect to be more subtle or to add a transition, get the paint off your brush and then leave it moist with water and smooth out the area. Next, I'll use some gloss varnish, Citadel Ard Coat in this instance, to make other parts look wet and shiny but without adding any new colour. I painted this all over the gums and teeth, the eyeballs themselves, as well as on the inside of the eyelids. All of the slimy gutworm cables, the nasty messy worm cables at the back of the tracks, and the nasty brown goopy stuff. To add some cool tarnished metal effects, I'll use my new favourite toy, Dirty Down Rust. Both the pot and the model need to be warmed to the touch for this paint to be most effective, so a quick blast with a Hello Kitty hairdryer should do the trick. I slopped it on all over, wherever I wanted the rust streaks and marks to develop. It's also very useful to add to recesses to bump up the contrast and add a bit of colour variation. I used a wet cotton bud to break up the hard edges of the effect as it was drying, and to rehydrate other areas to make the effect a bit more pronounced. Finally, let's finish this model off with a bit of a treat. Some armour highlights using a 30-year-old paint. Dwarf Bronze from the early 90s Citadel paint line, still sealed. Let's see if it's still good. I mean, you know it's going to be, right? Boom, like the day it was made. I used this to add a couple of rough, quick edge highlights to the sharp edges of the armour panels that hadn't already been heavily weathered, and this will help just bring out a bit of visual interest on the armour where it might otherwise be quite dull. And there we go. A true demon engine straight from your most twisted nightmares and ready to play on the tabletop. Totally thematic, totally unique, and totally ridiculous. As I said, obviously you're welcome to copy exactly what I've done, but what I hope you take away from this video is the spirit of experimentation, and the joy and happy accidents you can have while making a mess and having fun creating something new. This was barely planned. I knew I'd like to have a tank with teeth and eyes, but beyond that I was just winging it and seeing where the creative energy took me. If you like this kind of thing, I've got loads of recommendations for you. There's obviously David Soper's famous Golden Demon winning Nurgle Predator from the early 90s, that's well worth researching. You can see how I painted and customized my Bringers of Decay Nurgle themed Chaos Space Marine army, or how I made my Nurgle Eye Bearers. Also, if you like custom Nurgle armies, check out Panda Mango's amazing warband Egreb and Friends. FYI, I'm starting to pack up and ship out the signed post-Vitruvian Man art prints from my Reimagining Space Marines video. I'm doing it by hand, but all of the pre-orders should start arriving with you in the next couple of weeks. If you want one for your wall, head over to midwinterminis.com and grab one. Huge thanks to the amazing family of Midwinter Minis supporters on Patreon. You guys and girls literally keep this channel going, and a warm welcome to this week's newest members. Lucas Redshaw, Mimicus, Lars Bieck, Shrinpo, Colin Hufnagel, Maxwell Ammerman, Omadon, Alex Belka, Self, David, It's Wind, Guillermo, George Steinfurth, Ed Collins, Michael Shermer, DJ Wraithlord, and Isaac King. Don't forget to check out audible.com/midwinterminis or text midwinterminis to 500-500 to get a 1-month free trial of Audible on me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.